Welcome to The 5 Books, where each week we talk with a Jewish author about 5 books that are near and dear to them. My name is Tali Rosenblatt-Cohen, and today I'll be talking with Samantha Ellis about her book Always Carry Salt, a memoir of her journey to preserve her Jewish-Iraqi language and culture.
It started being about language because the language of the Jews of Iraq is going extinct. I mean, I've known this my whole life. The clock has been ticking. But soon after I became a mum, I started realising I wouldn't be able to pass this on to my son. It just felt like this silence was coming and I was going to be lost in translation even within my own home, my own family. I realised that you can't just talk about language without talking about what language holds.
Samantha Ellis is the daughter of Iraqi Jewish refugees and the author of How to Be a Heroine and Take Courage. Her plays include How to Date a Feminist, Cling to Me Like Ivy, and Operation Magic Carpet. Her journalism has appeared in The Guardian, The TLS, The Spectator, Literary Review, and more. She worked on the first 2 Paddington films. She lives in London, where Always Carry Salt was published under the title Chopping Onions on My Heart. In this episode, Samantha shares how reading Saidiya Hartman's Lose Your Mother resonated with her own experience of a family story with no path back.
When I first read it, it really sort of startled me and it really hit me. I've just found it so powerful because I felt like for me the rupture was the story too. People kept asking me when I said I was doing this book, oh, so the last chapter will be you in Baghdad, and I kept saying, well, no, it's not going to be, because it's long been a criminal offence to have any association with the State of Israel. They recently made it a death penalty offence. So I'm not going back to Iraq. There is no going back.
And we'll hear how Claudia Roden's The Book of Jewish Food helped Samantha reconnect with her Iraqi Jewish culture.
I mean, there's a lot of sort of hand work in Iraqi Jewish food. You're always kind of rolling or sort of pressing. And I felt like if I'm doing with my hands what my great-great-grandmothers were doing with their hands, and then if I'm putting the same tastes into my mouth that they were doing, there just was something, a very visceral connection. It really was like a way of sort of transporting myself back there in a way that I couldn't do.
All that and more coming up next. Welcome to The 5 Books. I'm so happy to have you here. I learned so much from your book about the Iraqi Jewish community for sure, but I also was thinking so much about what we pass on, both intentionally and unintentionally. And you provide this framework for what it means to wrestle with a culture when you're separated from its place and its language. And I'm excited to dive into all of it. So can you start a little bit with just how you would describe your book and how you came to write it?
Thank you. Yeah, it's so nice to be here. I suppose it's a memoir, really. It started being about language because the language of the Jews of Iraq is going extinct. And I grew up with it. My parents spoke it. It was all around me. It was more present than English. In fact, I used to think when I was a little girl that English was a language for children, sort of nursery and picture books. And I just thought when I grew up, I would speak it. Some people call it a language, some people call it a dialect, but it's Judeo-Iraqi Arabic. It's the Jewish dialect or the Jewish language spoken in Iraq. It is going extinct, and I mean, I've known this my whole life. The clock has been ticking. But soon after I became a mum, I started realising I wouldn't be able to pass this on to my son. And I felt really devastated. It just felt like this silence was coming and I was going to be lost in translation even within my own home, my own family. And I wanted to know more about it before it was gone. But it turned into something bigger because I realised that you can't just talk about language without talking about what language holds, all the stories, the recipes, the memories, the culture, the rituals and everything else. So it became a sort of bigger book for me.
And I know that it's called Always Carry Salt in the US, and it was published in the UK with a different title. So can you tell us what each of those titles mean?
Yes. So in the UK, it was chopping onions on my heart, which is a phrase in Judeo-Iraqi Arabic. I'm going to pronounce it really badly because I'm sort of classic, the child of the people who speak it, and that's part of the story is that I don't really speak it. But in the Arabic, it's Yidrum Basal al-Rasifadi, which means you're chopping onions on my heart. It's like you're rubbing salt in the wound. You can say it almost kind of jokily, or you can say it like you really mean it. It can be one or the other. Always carry salt salt is not a phrase in the language, but it was something that we always did because we always carried salt, and some of us still do, in fact, to ward off the evil eye. So it's a sort of a protection, a sort of a superstitious thing. And my mum would always sew sachets of salt if we went on a plane or whatever. She'd collect them and she'd sew them into the kind of the hems of my clothes when I was a little girl.
Book 1, A Jewish Book from Childhood, Megillat Esther, the Book of Esther.
Both my parents are from Baghdad. My mother left in 1971, which was quite late, and my dad left when most of the Jews left in 1951. And I was just surrounded by the language, the culture, the food. I mean, that was really my identity, was the Iraqi Jewish identity. We weren't particularly religious, but in Iraq, Purim is the festival. It was more important than the other festivals, and it was a huge party, and there was all sorts that went on. And one of the things that Iraqi Jews do that I don't know either other Jews do is on Purim there was this card game they would play for money called Dosa, and they would gamble, and even the kids would get money to gamble with, and it was all quite high stakes. And also obviously the dressing up, giving food, all of that, and there are lots of special foods associated with it. My favourite is zangula, which is, well, Nigella Lawson put them in her book and she called them something different, but she says that they are fried dough squiggles. Well, I can't really do better than that. That's a brilliant explanation. And you kind of dip them afterwards into a sweet syrup with a bit of orange flower water or rose water or both. And they come out just absolutely gorgeous, and you have to eat them sort of crunchy from the pan, really.
You've written about how your family's memories sort of felt like your own, and it was particularly poignant when you were describing how your mother and most of the remaining Jews who were there in 1970 were rounded up, and that experience really became like part of your subconscious. I'm wondering about how that blur between inherited memory and your lived experience affected the way you saw your own story.
I felt very much like the stories that were around me were more interesting than anything that was going on in my own life, and which maybe is why I was also drawn to kind of fiction as well. As a girl, I was a big reader. I was less interested in what was happening in my sort of boring life in London. What you describe is, yes, my mum's family, they tried to escape Iraq, and the way they were going to do it was the way a lot of people had done it, which was to be smuggled over the border by Kurdish smugglers who really rescued a lot of people. They were absolutely amazing. And they got stopped at the last checkpoint, my mum and her family, and turned back and arrested, and they were imprisoned. And I think there were around 100 people in prison at the same time. There were a few thousand Jews in Iraq at that time. It wasn't the majority of the community, but it was this huge number of people who were sort of in this prison. And I grew up on these stories. I grew up knowing they'd been to prison. I grew up terrified of watermelon because my mum told me this story about how one day they were given a watermelon by one of the guards. I mean, it was supposed to be a kind of happy story that she could tell, you know, me as a child about prison. You know, it was a kindness. But in my mind, watermelon was prison, and it became very associated, and I couldn't eat it for many, many years. So there were these sort of, I suppose it's trauma resurfacing, isn't it, really? These things that I didn't understand about what had happened and how I was living my own life that affected me quite a lot. I used to have a lot of nightmares about running through a sort of desert and being chased by men in moustaches, because I was told that the Mukhabarat, the secret police, always wore these big moustaches in the bath party time, and that was what I was scared of. And so I had this idea that these men with these big moustaches were chasing me through a desert, and I had these nightmares for years and years and years.
I know that reading, as you mentioned, was such a huge part of your childhood. You wrote a book called How to Be a Heroine, which was a lot about the books that you were reading and how you were identifying yourself in stories. What was it, I guess, that drew you to storytelling, or at what moment did you feel like storytelling meant something more to you?
I mean, How to Be a Heroine really came out of the fact that when I was young, I really felt I couldn't see myself in any of the stories I was reading. And I also was looking for role models. I was looking for new ways to be. I was looking for things I could do. I didn't really understand. I think now, looking back, it's a sort of growing up between cultures, and you don't really understand what you can be. I wasn't going to be British in the way that I saw British people be, and I wasn't going to be Iraqi in the way that I saw the women in my family were. They were all incredibly glamorous and very confident, and they could belly dance beautifully, and they wore shalimar, and they smoked, and they could cook everything, and they could sort of conjure up a meal for 50 people from their freezer, and, and I felt like that wasn't necessarily where I was going either. And I suppose I was looking to books for other things I could do, other kinds of woman I could be.
And then tell me about the story of Esther, or the Megillah.
So when I was very small, I remember obviously wanting to be a princess. We all want to be a princess, probably. And I had this conversation with my mum, and she was getting ready to go out for the evening, and I used to sit next to her while she was putting her makeup on. And she had these 3 coal pots, eyeliner coal pots from Baghdad in the shape of a peacock and 2 trees. And I would sit and kind of flick the tail up of the peacock, flick it up and down. And I would talk to her. And while we were talking, she said, well, you can't marry a prince because there are no Jewish princes, so you're not going to be a princess. And it was really quite definite, a little bit kind of just a hard no. And I was, pretty devastated. I already didn't have long blonde hair, and, it was already going wrong for me on the sort of princess front. And then Purim came along, and I thought, oh, this is a loophole, because she becomes a queen. I mean, it's even better than a princess. I was really, like a lot of Jewish girls, very keen on Esther. And I had this Esther dress that I wore year in, year out that my mum made. It was sort of cream satin with gold braid, and it had this little kind of circle of silk flowers on the top. And, I absolutely loved that dress. I would have worn it every day if I could. And yeah, it was just this idea that you could be a Jewish queen.
Were there any echoes of her story that felt familiar to you?
I mean, I suppose now the hiddenness kind of makes sense to me. It didn't then. I mean, maybe that was part of it. I remember knowing that she was from Persia, which was near Iraq, that sort of felt important. I did get more and more inspired by her courage because she does save everyone. And I found that incredibly exciting. And I was, I suppose early on, you get told there's a beauty contest and then she becomes the queen, and it's all very kind of Disney princessy, kind of the whole thing. And then later you realise actually the story's so much darker, and I remember reading the Megillah and realising there is no beauty contest in there. There isn't one. That's sort of been told to us later. And wondering about Vashti. Why has she been executed? Do you really want to marry someone who's executed one wife already? I remember being scared by how many questions went unanswered.
You talk in How to Be a Heroine about taking what you need from a book at the time. So it makes sense that you took in the Disney princess aspect as a young child and then read it differently as an adult. I'm also curious to hear, you talk about Marjorie Morningstar by Herman Wouk in the book. And we did have a guest, Francine Claxburn, who talked about it as well from a different perspective. So I'd love to hear your take on that.
Well, I came to Marjorie Morningstar much later, and I thought, oh, maybe this was the Jewish book that I should have had all along, because I'm a playwright as well, and she works in the theatre. It was very exciting to me to see this Jewish heroine in theatre, and so much of the book, she is really kind of an exhilarating figure. She's going after what she wants, and she's creative, and she's in love, and I suppose I was quite devastated by the ending. I really felt that Herman Wouk turns on her at the end, and it's such a long book. So you are with her and with her and with her, and you're following every twist and turn of her story. And then at the end, suddenly, she's kind of reduced by the book to this kind of sad, pathetic figure. And I felt that he punished her at the end, for her desires. And I don't know. You sort of don't know what happened there, really. Whether he felt he had to or something, because the rest of the book, he's with her as well, you feel. So I felt quite sort of angry about that. When I sort of got to the end, I felt quite sort of devastated.
Book 2, A Jewish Book from Adulthood, The Book of Jewish Food by Claudia Roden. You have said that the Book of Jewish Food by Claudia Roden shaped your Jewish identity as an adult.
Yeah.
What was your first encounter with that book, and why did it resonate so deeply?
I think it was very soon after it came out that I got hold of a copy. I love Iraqi Jewish food, but for a long time I felt I couldn't cook it, and it was a real source of sort of disconnect for me. So, I mean, it started when I was at school. My mum used to make me these amazing packed lunches for school. You know, she used to go to the bakery for the special pita bread, and then she would be frying the aubergine slices, and then we would have them with the, you know, the black eggs that she had cooked around the chicken overnight, and hummus and salad. I mean, not every day, I'm sure, but my memory, these amazing meals with umber, the mango pickle, which is the sort of iconic Iraqi Jewish pickle. And at some point people started kind of, you know, laughing at this, and I just, you know, I was a coward. I kind of switched to these kind of, you know, white bread and Philadelphia cheese sandwiches. And then when I went to university, my mum bought me a rice cooker, you know, so I could, you know, rice is everything in our in our community. And I didn't use it. I mean, I sort of had this imposter syndrome. How can I cook Iraqi Jewish food? I'm not from there. What if I get it wrong? Of course I'm going to get it wrong. It's not me. It's not my thing. It's my parents' thing. I don't know how. So again, I sort of felt very sort of uncomfortable. And if I did ever try and cook, you know, anything like that, I felt like I was sort of almost putting it on like a costume, like a little girl trying your mum's high heels or something. I just felt I couldn't do it right. I wasn't walking properly. I wasn't doing it properly. And then I left university. Soon afterwards, I was living with friends in London, and I had this very un-Iraqi Jewish life. You know, sort of my friends came from all over the place, and our parents didn't know each other. They didn't come from the same street in Baghdad. I didn't call their mums auntie. You know, I started feeling very disconnected and very estranged and strange to myself. And around that time, I felt this urge to start cooking the food again. And around the time that I started cooking the food again, Claudia Roden's book came out, and it's this huge, I mean, masterwork. I mean, it's got over 800 recipes. And one of the things that was most astonishing was that, to me, was that it had a whole section about Iraq, and it had a whole section about all the other places Jews have been in the world. So it was sort of setting us in the context of all the other ways that you could be Jewish, and all the other ways that you could kind of eat Jewish or express your Jewish identity through food. I remember I had this Ashkenazi flatmate, and I was very annoying because I used to hold the book up and say, look how enormous the Sephardi section is, and look how tiny the Ashkenazi section is. I mean, it was a bit mean of me. But I just remember feeling so proud that I was part of this huge kind of culinary tradition. And actually it wasn't just stuff that my family cooked. It was this huge thing, and it went back so long in time. And I remember reading the stories, because it's not just the recipes she collects so many stories, and it's almost like time travel, because most of the places that she was writing about, there aren't Jews cooking those recipes in those places anymore. And that was obviously the same for Iraq. You know, there are, as far as we know, only 3 Jews in Iraq now. And certainly in the 90s, when I was first reading these recipes, there were not very many, maybe a few hundred. And I just found this food as a way in. And that's how I started feeling connected again to my identity as well, through the cooking. I don't know, there was something, it was like plugging in. I just felt like my hands sort of took over. I knew what to do. And then I used to kind of have these big meals for my friends. And I just felt like I was sort of drawing a line from where I came from to where I was. And it felt very reassuring and comforting.
It's amazing how food can do that. You can physically bring back something that's lost.
Yes.
I mean, Roden is often described as both a food writer and an anthropologist. Do you see yourself doing something similar in this book, Always Carry Salt, tracing memory and migration and belonging through recipes?
Yes, I did put in some recipes in the book. I wasn't sure. I wasn't going to, actually. I mean, the book was going to be about language, and I mean, I'm not a food writer, so it was, you know, a bit of a stretch for me. But I started to realize that food was one of the, as you say, a way of going back in time or reconnecting. I mean, there's a lot of sort of handwork in Iraqi Jewish food, as you're always kind of rolling or sort of pressing or sort of stamping out with your hands. And I felt like if I'm doing with my hands what, you know, my great-great-grandmothers, whatever, were doing with their hands, and then if I'm putting the same tastes into my mouth that they were doing. There just was something, a very visceral connection. It really was like a way of sort of transporting myself or translating myself back there in a way that I couldn't do. I also felt like, I'm not going to be able to be fluent in my language, or certainly my son will not be fluent in it. But I could give him a recipe. I could cook the food for him now, and he could eat the food of his ancestors, and then he could cook it when he's older, and that would be a way of passing on. So, yeah, and I was very influenced by the way Claudia Roden weaved recipes in with the stories. And there was something really lovely as well, because she's not prescriptive. She sort of says, some people put this, some people put cumin, some people don't put cumin. In Iraq, they do this. I was just making the other day this sweet and sour fish from Iraq, Salona, and she reminded me that Iraqi Jews use date syrup, not sugar, to make up the sweet and sour, which I thought everyone did, but actually it's just the Jews of Iraq. And it gives us this kind of treacliness and this kind of dark colour that is kind of sort of unexpected in the dish, I think. It makes it, I don't know, it's delicious, I think. But she suggests other ways you can make up the sweet and sour, So she's very sort of open, but with all of these options is a story, is a different place. So even though food wasn't going to be in the book at all, it became quite a big part of it.
It adds so much to the book, and especially when you talk about, making food for your son. I'm wondering if there's a particular dish that, as you were writing about, felt particularly meaningful to you.
Yeah, I mean, the one that we cook most often is, we call it makbuz, which means baked. And some people call it baba batama. It's date biscuits or date balls, and it's crushed dates. Sometimes people put a little bit of orange flower water with them in, and it's encased in a pastry and baked, sometimes with sesame seeds over the top. They are the taste of home for me. My mum always has hundreds in her freezer. And my son couldn't say makbuz when he was little, so he started saying matabuz, and we all call it that now. And at the beginning, when he first said it, I thought, oh my God, this is how language dies. It's supposed to be makbuz, it's matabuz. But actually then I just thought, no, it's how language evolves within families, and actually something has been preserved. He is eating the food and he's saying an approximation of the word. And now, of course, he pronounces it better than me. So, it worked out in the end.
Book 3, A Book That Changed Your Worldview. Lose Your Mother by Saidiya Hartman.
Well, Saidiya Hartman, I mean, she's an amazing writer, and I love everything she does. And in this book, she talks about going back to Ghana, as a lot of people were going back to Ghana to sort of rediscover their roots, even taking Ghanaian names that they would have had before their families were enslaved and transported away from Ghana, and trying to find family stories and trying to find ancestral villages. And she decided not to do any of that. She felt it was impossible for her to work out where her family had come from, and actually often there just wasn't the evidence for people to really, be sure. And she said something like, for me, the rupture is the story. So it's not about trying to kind of draw a line back and connect, but to look at the rupture. And when I first read it, it really sort of startled me, and it really hit me. I've just found it so powerful, because I felt like for me the rupture was the story too, because Jews can't go back to Iraq. So people kept asking me when I said I was doing this book, oh, so the last chapter will be you in Baghdad. And I kept saying, well, no, it's not going to be, because there is no Jewish community in Iraq. It's long been a criminal offence to have any association with the State of Israel, and this is a law designed to keep out Iraq's Jews, because most of the Jewish community were airlifted to Israel in 1950 to 51. So everyone has someone. I mean, in my case, it's my dad, but everyone in the community has someone. And they recently made it a death penalty offence. So I'm not going back to Iraq. There is no going back. And there is this huge sense of rupture between, obviously, much more painful for my parents who can't go back to where they're actually from. But in the next generation, also just this sense of, a slash through the kind of line, or a break in the chain, and that we can't sort of return. I felt this idea that the rupture was the story. I found it I felt it was useful to me, but I also felt it was kind of useful for a lot of people who can't go back to their childhoods or to their parents' childhoods. I mean, because in every case you can't go back, of course, everyone's estranged from their own past. And this idea of kind of spending time with the rupture, of understanding the uneasiness and not trying to wrap it up in a neat bow or make a happy ending where there wasn't one, felt very, very, very important to me.
I guess if you could describe a little bit about how she stays with that rupture and what her exploration looks like that then resonated for you.
So she spends a lot of time in Ghana, and she goes to the, there's now a lot of tourism around slavery in Ghana, and she goes to all these sites and she talks to people, and she's never getting what we've read in other books about people going back to Ghana. She's never getting any catharsis. She's never getting any answers. She's never getting any resolution. And to me, that felt very sort of truthful, because, often we don't get these things, and real life isn't like that. And I always felt like, even if, the law in Iraq changed today and I went back to Iraq, I think of it as back to, but I've never been. I don't think it would be a joyful return. I don't think there would be catharsis. My community isn't there anymore. There would be no one to visit. I don't know if any family graves are there anymore or what condition they might be in. The last synagogue, I think, is sort of semi-operating, but I don't know. You would be seeing ghosts and traces and echoes. And I don't know, it just felt like good company to have while I was thinking about this, to read Saidiya Hartman's book. And she's not trying to process it to get past it to a happy ending. She's living with it, which is what we all have to do, I guess. And I also found the way she used storytelling incredibly. I mean, she's a wonderful storyteller. She's developed this method she calls critical fabulation, which is when the archives run out, she will, in an informed way, tell stories. She talks about filling in the blank spaces of the historical record and representing the lives of those deemed unworthy of remembering. And there's also, not nearly to the same extent or in the same way, of course, as what she's talking about, the victims of slavery. But even so, there is erasure in my community, in our story. It's very hard to see ourselves represented. There's a handful of books about us. We're often not mentioned in books about Iraq or books about the history of the Jews. Often it's just a kind of quick footnote or a small mention. There's no real, sense of our story. And in Iraq itself, a lot of memories have been erased. So, for example, Saddam Hussein set up a committee because he was annoyed that a lot of music that was still being played on the radio in Iraq after the Jews had gone was by Iraqi Jews. So they started calling them folk songs, or saying no one knew who'd written them. So there was that kind of erasure as well. And then those same musicians, when they got to Israel, found that people didn't want to listen to their music because it was seen as Arabic music. It was seen as the music of the enemy. So there was that erasure as well. And I felt there were a lot of points where I couldn't find out anymore. I was sort of blocked. It was a dead end. And the idea that we can use our imaginations a little bit felt very important. I try to respect the points where the archive runs dry, to not try and say there were things that we knew that we didn't know.
Book 4, the book you're reading now, Scaffolding by Lauren Elkin.
I am actually rereading, I've just read it and I'm reading it again, Scaffolding by Lauren Elkin, who's a novelist who lives in London. It's a book set in Paris, where she used to live. It's about a psychoanalyst in Paris living in this building that's sort of haunted by ghosts. She's also haunted by various sort of stories, and she's trying to renovate her flat, and the building is both kind of becoming new and also haunted. It's really about the stories we carry, and we can't really set down their weight. And there's this bit where she says to come to each other new, how impossible that is. And of course, you can't come to anyone new. You come with all this stuff and all these stories, whether it sort of is apparent immediately or later. It's also very kind of sexy, kind of feminist, kind of Parisian. It's just a beautiful book. It's a beautiful book that's full of ideas about psychoanalysis and about haunting and about trying to live a happy life and what that means and whether that hurts people or not, and the weight of history and the weight of Paris's Jewish history. I really loved it.
Book 5, the author's latest book, Always Carry Salt, a memoir of preserving language and culture, by Samantha Ellis. There are several terms for your heritage. You're obviously Iraqi Jewish. People refer to it as Mizrahi, Sephardi, Middle Eastern, North African. And, you also talk about the difficulties of naming language. So I wonder if you could just unpack those layers for us a little bit and what feels most accurate for you and what do you feel gets flattened in those acts of naming?
Sure. I mean, I would say I'm Iraqi Jewish. Some people say we're Babylonian Jewish because the Jews were first brought to what's now Iraq, what was then Babylon, by Nebuchadnezzar in 597 BCE. And there was a continuous Jewish community from then till now, until the 70s anyway. The language is tricky as well because, first of all, some people say it's a dialect. Some people say it's a language. And it's a joke, well, not really a joke, it's not a very funny joke made about Yiddish, first of all, that language is just a dialect with an army and a navy. And of course, like Yiddish, my language did not have an army or a navy. Some people call it Judeo-Baghdadi, which doesn't feel quite right to me because it was also spoken by Jews across Iraq. My grandfather's family are from Basra, they spoke it as well. Some people call it Jewish Arabic, Judeo-Arabic, and there's all these different names for it. I've settled on the one that UNESCO uses, but everyone uses different names. And this also kind of was quite distressing to me because there's an instability around it. You want it to be like French or German or Japanese, it's got a name and that's it. And then the word Mizrahi is a very useful umbrella term for Jews from the Middle East and North Africa. But I mean, its origins are not great. It means Eastern in Hebrew, and it was used for a lot of people who came from places that are not east of Israel and not used for people who came from places that are east of Israel. It was used pejoratively. So a lot of Iraqi Jews will not use it. I mean, unfortunately, it is a useful term, so I do use it occasionally, but I don't love it.
You write that language needs keepers, not just speakers. Can you tell us a little about what that means to you?
Yes, I mean, I got this concept from Language City by Ross Perlin, who works with endangered languages in New York. And his amazing book is about the endangered languages in New York because so many last speakers of endangered languages have ended up in New York as immigrants or refugees, that they're actually this enormous quantity of last speakers of endangered languages in New York. It's this extraordinary linguistic diversity. And he talks about how languages need keepers because, there's this obsession with speakers. And the thing is, there are lots of speakers of my language now, but they're not passing it on. So very quickly, in one generation or two generations at most, we're going to go from having lots of speakers to having hardly any or none. But what we do have are keepers, so people who speak a little bit and people who want to know about it and people who study it and people who love it and who talk about it and tell its stories and remember as much of it as we can. So I suppose I found it comforting because I thought I've got to get fluent. Otherwise, what's the point? I can't do anything to help my language. But this was very freeing to me, the idea that actually I could be a keeper, if not a speaker. I mean, I would still like to get fluent, but I'm finding it very tricky to recover. I was better at speaking it when I was younger.
I wonder what your parents make of your interest in language and culture. Is this something that they really wanted you to keep hold of? Are they surprised by it?
Well, when I was growing up, if you came to our house, it was a very Iraqi Jewish house. And I think we looked like we were very much holding on to our culture. But, for example, I went to a secular school and I went and studied English literature at university. So in some ways, I was moving away from it the whole time. My parents, like many people in our community, didn't teach me and my brother the language. There's a variety of reasons. They thought there was no point. It was going extinct anyway. There was no community left in Iraq. They could see the way it was going. They also thought it would confuse us. We weren't going back to Iraq, so we ought to learn the language here. There was a health visitor who advised my parents not to. They said it would confuse me and my brother. So there were sort of all sorts of reasons that they didn't do it. But then when I did pick up quite a lot of it when I was an older child, they were delighted. They were delighted. And they have been so supportive of this book. My mum in particular, read many drafts and was just, on the end of a phone throughout with pesky little questions about Judeo-Iraqi Arabic and all sorts of other things. One of the great things actually was being able to interview my parents and my grandmother. She passed away just over a year ago, so I sort of got to interview her almost just in the nick of time, really, because I had all these stories that I thought I knew, and actually I'd heard them in pieces, and I maybe heard them the first time when I was too young to hear the whole thing, so they sort of skipped the bad bits, or maybe I'd eavesdropped and heard them that way, or maybe I'd been interrupted. And there were lots of stories I really thought I knew that I didn't, or I didn't know them correctly, or I mixed two things together. And it was incredibly connecting for me to sort of pin down some of these stories and learn more about them. I found it so psychologically helpful to me. I was doing it for the book, but I was really doing it for me.
I felt so lucky that you shared them with us. It was stories that I hadn't heard. I know you talk about, I think you call it like Iraqi cliche bingo of like these stories that anyone who's grown up with these parents or grandparents would have heard. They were only familiar to me from like a few books. So they were really fun to read about. And, and you also write about the more painful parts. The 6-Day War of 1967 was a turning point for Iraqi Jews. And you write about the execution of your mother's cousin and how that seemed to impact your mom for a long time. I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about that.
Yes, so after 1967, after the defeat in the 6-Day War, Iraq really turned on its Jews, and there were lots of sort of discriminatory laws, and there was this sort of panic that the Jews were spying for Israel. So there were lots of arrests, and it was a very, very terrifying time. And one of the things that's happened was that they arrested several boys and men and said that they were Zionist spies, and there was a show trial. And then they were convicted and they were hanged in public, and it was a sort of day of celebration in Iraq. And my mother was told, "You've got this cousin," and she didn't know. So her uncle had married a Muslim woman and the family was estranged, and she didn't know that she had this Muslim cousin who was 17, and he had been one of the boys who was arrested as a Zionist spy. They actually said he was older because, he was a child. They couldn't hang him, even under the laws they had then. It was still illegal what they did. He was one of the people who was hanged. So I really wanted to put the story in because I felt it was important to talk about the complexity of the Iraqi Jewish experience. He was a Muslim. He was brought up a Muslim. Maybe he didn't know that he had a Jewish family. Maybe he didn't know his father was originally Jewish. I don't know how much he knew. And he was accused of being a Zionist spy and executed for it. And I felt that was an important part of the story to tell.
There's so many strains that you weave in, ancient history and more modern history, as you're talking about, which I so appreciated. As being raised in the UK, you also write about like history of British Jews. There were just so many different interesting strains. One of the things I found the most fascinating was you talk about these magic bowls that are now attributed to have been created by Iraqi Jewish women. I wonder if you could just also tell us a little bit about those.
Yes, so there were these incantation bowls or magic bowls, and they were found in 6th century Mesopotamia, and they were often cemented in the thresholds of homes. When archaeologists first started discovering them, they thought they were just crockery, and they were sort of throwing them away, and then they started looking at the markings on them. They often have writing on them that goes in a spiral. And for a long time, they thought they were written by men, and now there's this kind of turn in the scholarship about them where they think actually a lot of the bowls were written by magic women. And what you would do is you would go to one and you would say, I think there's a demon in my house and that's why things are going wrong in my life. And then they would write these kind of incantations or curses on these bowls to kind of set you free from whatever was affecting you. And a lot of them are written in Jewish Babylonian Aramaic, which is the language of the Babylonian Talmud, of course, but it's the precursor of my language because it's what the Jews were speaking at the time. And I was so excited by these, and particularly lots of them conjure up Lilith. And I found this fascinating because Lilith is this kind of, demoness who's terrifying, and she seems to be particularly dangerous to mothers and children. And, as a mother, I was, sort of felt immediately protective. But at the same time, I've always felt, Lilith was a reclaimed feminist heroine, and actually her story as we know it is of defying the patriarchy and then suffering for it. And so I had this affinity with Lilith, and then had this thought suddenly that actually these bowls were not meant to trap Lilith and these other demons, possibly, but maybe they were meant to be kind of small homes. Maybe they were meant to be creating these small spaces where Lilith could live without sort of haunting the rest of the homes. And I was very excited to go to the British Museum in London and get to handle some of these bowls. They were supposed to be turned upside down to contain whatever they were containing. But in the museums, because everyone wants to see what's written on them and drawn on them, and there's often these kind of cartoonish kind of versions of sort of Lilith with kind of curly hair and kind of wild eyes, and they're turned the right way up. And you sort of wonder what demons are kind of being released in the museum. And I had this one morning where I was flipping the bowls over backwards and forwards, and it felt quite exciting,
Lilith let loose in the British Museum. Yeah. I love that. You write at the end of the book about the Tower of Babel and the act of translation. Mm. And even in just telling that story and your interpretation, I'm wondering how you see your role as translator.
Yeah, I was really excited by thinking again about, it's such a tricky story. Obviously it's an Iraqi story as well. And, and I sort of felt connected to it. But, you look at it and it looks like people want to build something together, and their punishment is for them to have lots of different languages. And, it seems, first of all, like building something together shouldn't be punished, but also that is this a punishment to have lots of different languages? I thought what was interesting is that, of course, after you have lots of different languages, you have translation. It's a magic power, isn't it, translating? Because you are turning one thing into another, and you are making a connection from one place to another where there isn't one. And I became quite inspired by this. And yeah, I think everyone who has parents from another place is a translator, whether there's a language involved or not. You're always translating from where you come from to where you are to where you're going. There's also the kind of emotional translation. I also realized writing the book that so many of my family spoke so many languages. It used to be the norm that they would just speak language after language after language. So it was this kind of multilingualism, that we sort of have lost, really. I'm no better. I don't speak lots of languages or anything like that. And I felt like a love of language was something I really just do want to pass on to my son. And I think linguistic diversity is as important as other kinds of diversity. It's different ways of thinking, and it's different ways of feeling, and it's different ways of expressing, and it's different humour. And I think even if my language is going extinct, I hope that there's something I can translate of its joy and verve and spirit and bawdiness as well. And, peculiarities, you know.
I think that's what your book felt like to me. It felt like a living piece of culture to pass on. I know you write about your son so much and how important it is for you, what you're passing on. You write, I'd been trying to write a story back to where I come from so I can tell it forward to my son. Has the process of writing this book changed what you hope he inherits from you?
Yes, I think so. I think I feel definitely more confident to be playful with my inheritance of my heritage. I think I had always felt quite anxious to try to be authentic all the time, and I'm not getting it right and I can't do it. And I realized that all those other people who went before me have, you know, they were messing around with recipes. They were coining new phrases. You know, I need to be doing that too. You know, if it's mine, I need to be able to play with it and enjoy it and adventure with it. And my son needs to as well. So that's something I felt quite excited that I could pass on to him. I suppose, you know, I have thought a lot about whether trauma is inevitably passed on. I did read that if you don't process intergenerational trauma, that it just goes on to the next generation and the next until someone is able to do the work to process it. And I wondered whether by writing this book I had done some of the work for myself that might help it be easier for my son. I don't know. We'll see. He's only 8, but I hope that that's the case. And he was a real sort of co-pilot with the book. He thought of himself throughout as the hero of it. You know, he had a lot of joy about that. And I enjoyed him enjoying it. And we talked when I was nearly finishing it about what the book was about. And he said to me, well, I can't be the hero because if I'm the hero, then I have to save it. And I haven't saved it. And it was this kind of devastating moment when I was like, oh my God, what do I say to him? And then I sort of thought, well, actually, real life doesn't have an ending. I said, you know, we don't know what you're going to do. There's any possibility. That felt free to me as well. I thought, well, I've also hopefully got a long way to live as well. And I have lots of things I could be doing. So not to feel like I had to preserve it in aspic in this moment, or it had to be saved or not saved by the time I'd finished writing the book, you know. That was quite liberating.
Well, thank you for sharing with us. I'm thinking of the always carry salt, and it is something that you are carrying with you, that, you know, all of those traditions and legacies and everything that's attached to it. And I'm just grateful that you were able to share it with us. You know, as I said, there's so many layers, the memoir, the family history, meditation on exile and rupture. I just was fully captivated, and thank you for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us today for the 5 books. Our guest today was Samantha Ellis, talking about her book, Always Carry Salt, a memoir of preserving language and culture. You can find a link to the book and all the others Samantha discussed in our show notes. If you've read one of the wonderful books recommended on our show, we'd love to hear about it. Drop us a comment on our Instagram at 5bookspod or in our email, team@5bookspod.org. If you'd like an email reminder to keep you up to date with new episodes, plus links to all the books we discussed, directly in your inbox, you can sign up for our newsletter in the show notes or on our website, 5bookspod.org. I'm Tali Rosenblatt-Cohen. Our producer is Odelia Rubin. Editorial and website support from Amelia Merrill. Music by Dove Rosenblatt and Blue Dot Sessions. Art by Elad Lifshitz of the Dove Abramson Studio. Thanks especially to the Jewish Book Council.